just a couple of minutes. All right. Welcome and thank you everyone for joining the conclusion of our three-part series on K-12 financial education requirements. My name is Raven Newberry and I'm the Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the National Endowment for Financial Education. So as we have been building up to NEFI's 2024 Financial Education, Innovation, and Impact Summit, we have been spotlighting important topics in the field of financial education. And with the continuing momentum around K-12 financial education requirements, it's a perfect time to explore this topic by featuring experts and advocates from across the country. So part one, which occurred on Tuesday, covered the passage of K-12 financial education requirement legislation, and part two, which was yesterday, covered a case study from Ohio that featured a funding mechanism for the state's requirement. And today we are concluding the series on a very important topic of the financial education requirements, which is highlighting evaluation efforts, and specifically from the states of Utah and Nevada. A little bit about today's structure. We're going to have about 15 minutes of presentations from our two experts today, and then we'll have a few minutes of prepared panel questions, and then we will have close this out with time for audience Q&A. So throughout the presentation, feel free to submit questions into the question box, and we will have those queued up for our two panelists today. So today we are joined by Dr. Brittany Griffin, the Policy and Communications Director from the Utah Office of State Treasurer, and Dr. Christine Mulhern, an economist from the RAND Corporation. So with that said, I am going to turn it over first to Dr. Griffin to introduce herself and share her presentation, and then we will queue up Dr. Mulhern.
Okay, can you all see my presentation and hear me?
Yes.
So my name is Brittany Griffin, and I'm the Policy and Communications Deputy for Utah Treasurer Marlo Oaks. I've been with the State Treasurer's Office now for about 6 years. Like many state treasurer's offices around the country, our office has a financial literacy function, and among my responsibilities, I oversee those efforts. In background, in Utah, the State Treasurer chairs the Office of and the office staffs a legislatively created body of about 50 private and public entities with an interest in financial empowerment. This organization is called the Utah Council on Financial and Economic Education. We also administer an investment challenge for students in grades 4 to 12 called the Utah Treasurer's Investment Challenge, and then actively participate in the review and revision of Utah's general financial literacy strands and standards, as well as our end of course examination, which was used in the evaluation 5 years ago. With that, I'll quickly provide a summary of our financial education history that ultimately led to our evaluation efforts that are at the heart of this conversation. So quickly, in 2003, the legislature passed the nation's first bill requiring all high school students to complete a one-semester graduation requirement of general financial literacy. Utah's class of 2008 was the first in the country to graduate under that mandate. As a state, we didn't stop trying to improve our efforts once the graduation requirement was in place, and we've continued to improve upon it. The evaluation that we conducted in 2018 was really important in our efforts to continue to find weaknesses and improve upon that. We also have, as I mentioned, an end of course examination that all students who take the course must complete. And then we also put in place an endorsement that our teachers must get in order to teach financial literacy. Carson Walker, who's originally going to present today, but unfortunately had a last-minute conflict arise, was one of the researchers who helped us pull together the evaluation. I was involved primarily on the sidelines, but still involved, so I'm happy to be here today to speak with you on that. So the review found that Utah students who've completed the general financial literacy requirement have better personal financial knowledge and make better behavioral choices than those who have not completed the requirements. That finding was key in helping us see the value in the course and motivation to then take some of the findings to improve upon it. Oops, let's see, went too far. So the program review had three primary components. The first was conducting a survey of adults who took the course and then those who did not, both within the state of Utah and outside of the state. Then we interviewed a sample of teachers and administrators, followed by a survey of a larger sample of teachers and administrators to identify some weaknesses and strengths from their perspective. And then the third part was analyze the results of the end of course examination that students completed during the years 2015 to 16, 16 to 17, and 2017 to 2018. We surveyed 1,500 high school graduates. Key questions for that survey were built using some nationally recognized financial literacy survey questions and other behavioral measures from FINRA's National Financial Capability Study. Approximately 500 of those students graduated from Utah public schools in 2008 to 2018. So they were 20 to 28 when they completed the survey. And they would have been required to take general financial literacy while they were in high school. Approximately 500 respondents graduated from Utah public high schools before the graduation mandate was in place, and so wouldn't have taken the course. And then we also surveyed 500 students who graduated from high schools in surrounding states, including Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada, from the years 2008 to 2018. So they at that time did not have a state mandate to take a financial literacy course. The survey, as I indicated, indicates that Utah public high school graduates who took one of the general financial literacy courses for graduation exhibited both higher average scores in knowledge and behavioral questions, which is really important because while knowledge is important when it comes to personal finance, the behavioral piece is really what we'd like to impact so that we know that our graduates are making better financial choices throughout their lives. So the interviews and surveys of financial literacy teachers and students helped us identify some weaknesses that could be addressed. So new instructors we found are overwhelmed by available resources, but they lack curated lesson plans. We also found that there's a lack of ownership and adequate oversight of general financial literacy instruction because it doesn't readily align with some of the traditional organizational structures of schools. We found that financial literacy classes are generally funded on an ad hoc basis, and staffing those classes appears to be a source of frustration for many administrators within the LEAs. There's also a lack of consistent, meaningful collaboration among general financial literacy instructors. We found that many general financial literacy instructors received limited feedback to assess their performance. And we also identified that there was a need for the end of course examination to be improved. An analysis of the end of course examination, as you're seeing on this screen, identified some expected results as well as some surprises. So the assessment showed a slight but steady increase in student performance over the years examined. The interviews, while the data didn't explain this, the interviews that we conducted with teachers and administrators appeared to indicate that this is because instructors are becoming more familiar with materials and the expectations for instruction. So that was a really positive finding from the evaluation. One of the things that was very surprising to me was that our male students performed consistently higher on the end of course examination compared to our female students averaged over the 3 years. I don't know why this is, but this is one of the things that we've been looking at and have recently formulated a committee to look into this further to identify some of the potential causes for this, and then make sure that we're meeting the needs of our female students better. Another surprise to me was that our Native American, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and African American students scored significantly lower on the assessment than our white students. So similar to our gender subgroup, we also have a group within the state working to identify some of the needs that these demographics might have that we can meet in order to address this discrepancy. Coming from the evaluation, we had several recommendations. We recommended that the State Board of Education report general financial literacy proficiency to strengthen school accountability. We also recommended that they expand assessment reporting to at least match the level of detail of the career and technical education assessment reporting. We recommended that they periodically review enrollment and assessment data quality and share superior lesson plans with all instructors. In addition, we asked that they consider whether financial literacy should be aligned within the CTE program. Administrators and instructors, we'd like them to identify and implement strategies to strengthen financial literacy within some of those low-performing subgroups, as well as implement continuous improvement with meaningful collaboration, feedback, and assessment. We've asked our administrators to ensure that the instruction has meaningful administrative oversight, similar to what they're providing to the other subject areas, and that administrators use financial resources to actively drive strategies to strengthen financial literacy. We also asked that the instructors ensure that they follow that requirement and offer the assessment to all students who take the class and graduate from a public high school, to ensure that our assessment data is as strong and as representative as it can be. Since the evaluation, our state auditor created a peer school comparison dashboard to display spending and performance for selected target school and then one or more of its peer schools as defined by the State Board of Education. And one of these areas that you can hone in on is the financial literacy test results. So this has been a really helpful dashboard and outcome of it. And then one more note, so if your state doesn't offer an end of course examination, Next Gen Personal Finance looked at our evaluation and partnered with Penn State to create a free pre-course test and post-course test for students to get some comparative data. So if your legislature doesn't have appetite in mandating a statewide exam, this is potentially something that you could look at. So we have a few projects that we're working on to help meet some of the needs. We're currently in the process of revising our Finance in the Classroom website to be a resource for teachers to get ideas on how to incorporate some of the best resources into more curated lesson plans. And that came as a direct result of recommendations from the evaluation. This website will be a resource for teachers of all grade levels, as well as for parents and community members, which will help reach the mission that we've really been trying to get at of all grade levels, not just 10 to 11, because we know the sooner students start thinking about and practicing financial literacy, the better the outcomes are going to be in the long term. We are in the beginning stages of working with the State Board of Education and planning student-led community nights where students can present what they learned to parents and other members of the communities. These can be tailored to the demographic needs of the area. We're in the initial planning stages, but I'm really excited about the possibility that this brings, both for students as well as their parents and other members of their community. We also recently reviewed and revised our strands and standards and end of course examination. And the State Board of Education is now looking to revise the teacher endorsement requirements and the General Financial Literacy Board rule. And they've invited our office as well as industry partners to be part of that process, which I think just improves outcomes. So with that, that concludes my prepared remarks. So I'll now pass it over to Dr. Mulhern on the process for evaluating Nevada.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about our evaluation of Nevada's financial education reform. Can you all see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, so this is joint work with Kate Kennedy and Zan Akuda-Lim, who are both at RAND with me, and then Janie Maloney, who's at the Nevada Department of Education. And so the goal of this study is to look at Nevada's financial education reform that passed in 2017. And with this, the Nevada legislature passed a requirement that all students in grades 3 through 12 receive some form of financial education in Nevada public schools. The goal of this reform, as laid out by the state, was to increase teachers' preparedness to deliver financial education, assess students' knowledge, and extend financial education beyond the classroom to families and communities. However, the state didn't actually provide a lot of guidance around how to implement financial education or how schools and teachers might reach these goals. Nevada as a state is very much into local control. And so as with most reforms in education, they left a lot of freedom up to schools and districts to choose how to implement financial education. But that also means there was a lot of uncertainty about how this was being implemented in the state. And so just to kind of give you an overview, so this reform was passed because there was a lot of agreement across the state that Nevada had a greater need for financial literacy. They were ranked 10th in terms of least financially literate states, and they have this really unique environment, as many of us know, with the legalization of gambling and just kind of how people perceive financial literacy in the state. And so one of the things that the state did was to update their standards for social studies. And so when they updated the standards, they did include key themes for financial literacy. And so in Nevada, the main standards around financial literacy that apply to grades 3 to 12 are financial decision-making, savings and spending, credit and debt, insurance, investing and risk, and then college and career readiness. And for grades 3 to 5, they have a slightly altered set of standards that are more relevant to students in those grades, but these are kind of the broad goals that the state has set out for students to learn through this mandate. And so where we come in is that we see the rollout of this mandate as an opportunity to learn One, how are schools actually implementing financial education under a state mandate? We know to some extent what the state schools were, but it's kind of less clear both to us and to a lot of the folks in the state how this was implemented on the ground. And then as a part of that, the goal was to understand what were some of the barriers to effective implementation, as well as some of the facilitators to successful implementation, and were there any positive impacts on students' financial knowledge that we might be able to measure. And so more broadly, I think this kind of evaluation can be really helpful for both folks in Nevada as well as in other places to understand how policy and regulation can impact financial education in schools, and what's the high level impact of a relatively broad policy on what students are actually getting in the classroom. What are some of the ways that we might be able to improve the effectiveness of these policies on financial education? So are there any common barriers that teachers or schools are facing that we may be able to address in how these programs are rolled out, or in how legislation is designed in the future? And then, how might we design some future financial education policies so they really kind of meet the goals of improving financial knowledge and skills, and some of the other goals that the state had laid out initially. So in terms of this study, we focus on two key research questions. So the first is, after Nevada implemented this mandate in 2017, how was financial education actually implemented in schools? Who were the folks implementing it? What materials did they use to teach it? And then how did implementation vary across community and school characteristics? And then we also look at the barriers and facilitators to successful implementation, to try and understand how financial education requirements can be effectively designed and implemented so that they're promoting financial well-being as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in order to answer these research questions, we take a three-stepped mixed methods approach. So the first one is kind of pretty descriptive, just seeking to define the standards created by the mandate. What was the policy change? How did it compare to what some other states are doing? Kind of understanding kind of what makes it both unique as well as similar to elsewhere, so that we might be able to learn from some of the steps taken in Nevada. And through this, we also met with Nevada leaders about the program. Kind of, these were the folks who designed it. So what was their thinking as they designed it? What were their goals? What resources or guidance did they provide to folks? And so trying to kind of map all this onto kind of the intentions versus what we were actually seeing kind of when we go out in the field and meet with teachers and other folks at schools. And so the second step here is to examine schools and teachers' efforts to meet the standards that were laid out by the state. And so for this, we interviewed school leaders about the implementation process, the time and resources. So these were the folks who kind of took the guidance from the state and had to decide what to communicate to teachers, how to kind of implement it within their schools. We also conducted focus groups with teachers about their implementation experiences. So really trying to understand kind of what's happening at the classroom level. And then looking across these interviews and focus groups to identify which program elements appear to be most effective. And then finally, we sought to describe students and teachers' experiences more broadly with the mandate, using a teacher survey about teachers' training related to financial literacy and participation in kind of financial education, kind of how they were teaching it in the classroom, what materials they were using, things like that. And then we're also measuring student and teacher participation in some types of financial education related programming. So kind of how much are they using resources like NGPF or EverFi, or what can we see about their engagement with those resources. And then across these data sets where we have a slightly larger sample, looking at how experiences differ by respondents' race or ethnicity, gender, location within the state, and then different kind of characteristics of the schools. So just to kind of summarize what we did in terms of the evaluation. So we have three kind of main types of data that we've used to answer these research questions. First are interviews and focus groups with a mix of teachers, school or district leaders who were often the curriculum directors at the district level, the state leaders, which included the folks who designed the legislation, as well as folks in the Nevada Department of Education who were responsible for some of the guidance that did get provided to schools and districts, and then a few community and curriculum partners. And so these interviews really focused on motivation for the legislation for the folks at the leadership level, and then experiences implementing financial education within schools. We also had a survey of about 300 financial literacy teachers in Nevada that focused on their training experience, the materials they're using, their perceptions of supports they've received from the school, the district, and the state, as well as what financial literacy topics they were covering in their classroom. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have some data from FEI&I and GPF on student and teacher engagement with these curriculum materials to try and understand who is using what across the state. And so we're still in the process, we're kind of wrapping up our evaluation right now. So we've spent a lot of time collecting this data. And so I just have a few kind of high-level findings from the evaluation itself, and then I want to emphasize some of the takeaways about the research process that might be helpful to other folks who are thinking about an evaluation of this sort. So first on the left is a bit of information, some of the preliminary findings that are coming out of our research. So first, the vast majority of teachers, over 90% of teachers, reported that they created or found their own materials on financial literacy, despite efforts from the state to distribute resources. And so it does seem like there is a need to focus more on getting robust or evidence-based curricula into the hands of teachers. I think about 60% of teachers were creating their own materials. And so not only does this take a lot of time and effort on their part, but it's also kind of unclear what they are teaching students. And so since there are a lot of great evidence-based free curricula out there, it seems like this is a really important area to focus on for supporting teachers. It was also encouraging. So most teachers believed that financial literacy was important and worthwhile. Teachers kind of were broadly kind of excited about students learning this material and thought it was really important. But they did note a number of challenges in terms of actually teaching it to students. The biggest challenge was that financial literacy is not a tested subject in Nevada, and I think not in most states, and especially in the younger grades where teachers were pressured to spend a lot of time on tested subjects in math and reading. They said it was really hard to carve out time to focus on financial literacy. And so that kind of, given that there wasn't a lot of state oversight around financial literacy, there's just kind of this requirement or mention that, oh, you all should be teaching financial literacy, but there's not really any reporting back up to the state level. It seems like it was an easy thing to kind of let slide or let get less attention because of how the accountability system works in most states. And then we also didn't find any evidence that financial literacy was contextualized to local communities or subgroups. So we did ask teachers a couple questions about kind of whether or not they tailored it to the types of students in their school, culturally responsive financial literacy education, and it really seemed like it was not tailored to kind of the unique circumstances that some of their students might be in. And so we're still working on this. We'll have a report out, I think, next summer, which will dive more deeply into these findings and others. And then just a few key takeaways on the research process for others who might be thinking about doing this. So one, we found that it was really important to gather perspectives from multiple types of stakeholders. The perspectives of the state leaders were very different from the perspectives of the teachers. And so kind of while kind of the state leaders were very excited about this and thought this was a great reform, once we kind of got down to the ground, it was clear that there wasn't actually as much happening in classrooms as the state leaders envisioned or hoped. And even though kind of they had some conversations with teachers, the teachers who were communicating a lot with the state office are often the ones doing the most. And so kind of once we started to get a more representative group of teachers, it was really helpful for seeing like what the barriers are, what are some of the things that kind of may not be happening that the state may not be aware of, and kind of helping that state identify some actions that they might take based on those perspectives. And kind of the same thing goes for the folks at the district and school level. There were a lot of different perspectives across offices within schools and types of schools, kind of based on their size. So Nevada has Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is, which is massive and kind of has a very different operation than some of these school districts, which have a couple hundred students in them. And so trying to understand the difference in how they think about rolling this out. Another point that came up was that it was not necessarily easy or straightforward to go about recruiting research participants for this study. And this largely seemed to be driven by financial literacy not being a tested subject. And so there was a lot of variation across schools and how it was implemented. Kind of, I think the impression we got from teachers was that if we had asked about a new reading curriculum or a math curriculum, it would have been kind of straightforward to know what to say to us, where they had to think a little bit harder about, oh, how am I teaching financial literacy? Like it wasn't something that they was kind of top of mind because it wasn't one of the core subjects that the state really emphasizes or that is tested. And so I think it's interesting kind of in the future to think more about how, given this push to prioritize financial literacy, kind of how do we kind of change some of the mindset around how people are thinking about it, how we can kind of gather information about it, because I think teachers are so used to providing data and information on these core subjects. But it's really helpful to also get this information on some of these other areas they're working on. And then the last point was that kind of when we started this and kind of all along, we've been really interested in what students are learning as a result of the reform, but it's really hard to find data on what students are learning. So obviously financial literacy is not a tested subject. Nevada doesn't have an end of course exam because it's kind of taught in different ways across grades and schools, and there's no kind of statewide survey of it at this point. And so in the future, it'd be really interesting to think about other kind of systematic data that might be collected on student learning. It was really interesting to see in the Utah study how you all managed to collect some of that. And so I think thinking about how to do that more broadly will be really helpful for understanding the impacts of these types of reforms. And that's all that I have.
Thank you both for those insightful presentations. And in addition to the recording, we will also share those slide decks for attendees if they would like that as a reference. And Dr. Mulhern, thank you for previewing when the report might be ready. If anyone is interested in finding that, if you are subscribed to NEFI's newsletter, we will be disseminating, I'm sure, those findings. So that is one place you'll be able to find those results once they are completed. So with that said, let's go ahead and transition into some panel questions. And the first is for Dr. Mulhern. So you touched on this a little bit, but in your experience with this research, what aspects of a financial education mandate do you think are most beneficial to evaluate? And for other states who might be looking to do this, what do you think those evaluations should or should not include?
Yeah, so I think one of the key pieces is to understand kind of what is happening in classrooms, that there's kind of a long way to go from a state level mandate down to what teachers are doing in the classrooms. And at least in places like Nevada, where there wasn't a lot of guidance, there could be a lot of things that are happening which really impact how much students might be learning or what they might be learning. And so I think focusing on gathering those teacher perspectives is, if possible, student perspectives, that's really important, rather than just kind of relying on the leadership who tend to be easier to access.
Thank you. It was interesting to hear about the differing perspectives from the different stakeholders. I think that was probably a valuable insight for other states to consider. And Dr. Griffin, I have a question for you. What was the biggest surprise to come out of the Utah evaluation? Is there anything that you would have liked to have more detail on? And if there was an evaluation done today, do you think there would be similar results, or would you expect to see something different?
One of the surprises that made sense after we were presented with the data is we actually have 185 different course titles for the financial literacy course, which goes to show the local control aspect of this and the differences that may exist within each of the courses. I think our strands and standards help provide some consistency across it, but there's obviously still some significant differences, starting with even the course title. I was also very surprised to learn that our female students and our minority students performed significantly worse on the examination than our male and white students. And then also that the course was not widely accepted as a permanent part of so many schools, despite the fact that when we conducted this survey, it had been in place for 10 years. I was also interested to find that more funding doesn't necessarily correlate with improved performance on the end of course examination. So there's other factors that are more of a driving force behind that performance than just throwing more money at the course in districts. We're actually in the process of considering doing another evaluation, since it's been 5 years since our last one. I hope that some of the issues that we identified in that initial evaluation have since been resolved, or at least improved upon, and that we see the trend of continued improved student performance on the course, as well as I would like to see more significant improvements in knowledge and behavior after the course has or after students have graduated and moved on. I expect that if we do the study, that we'll hone in on a few different questions to drill down on what really increases the effectiveness of the course, since funding doesn't, it's a factor, but it's not as significant as I would have thought that it was.
Thank you. The gender gap is interesting to me because in a literature review completed by Dr. Christiana Stoddard, found that there was a gender gap with states that offered financial literacy. That gender gap was closer, and in states that didn't, if there was financial education offered, female students were much less likely to engage with financial education courses. So I think it's interesting to see that mandate does have a mitigation of that gap, but there's still a gap in Utah of between female and male students. So thank you for highlighting that, and very exciting to hear another evaluation might be underway. I know that would be of interest to a lot of folks in the field. So we have some really great questions from the audience. So I want to pivot to some of those. So the first is from, we've had a group of 8th grade students who have been advocating for financial education in Illinois, and they've been joining us for the webinars all week. Thank you again for joining today. And they had a question, which was after yesterday's webinar meeting, they actually received an email inviting them to meet with Senator Faraci, I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, so apologies, in Illinois, and some key members of the Illinois State Board of Education. Do you have any advice on key topics that they should address, or any tips as they are preparing to speak?
I'll take this one first, at least. So our study shows that that there is improved knowledge and behavior long after you complete the course with regard to your financial knowledge and behavior. So there's value in the long term in mandating a course. And then I'd also emphasize just that money and financial skills are something that you need throughout all of your life and are critical to individual success, as well as the success of the larger economy. And imparting those knowledge and skills as young as you can really improves the outcomes in the long term, and is vital for the state's long-term economic prosperity.
Yeah, I feel like I have less expertise on this topic. But yeah, I would say kind of thinking about there are a lot of different ways these mandates have been designed. And so kind of thinking about some of the different ways they've been designed and looking at what you've learned across the other webinars, or what are some of the effective ways to design them, because it does seem like they can have a pretty different impact based on how they're rolled out.
Yes, that has definitely been a theme of all three webinars. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, and anything you can connect specifically to Illinois' unique ecosystem. We have a question about the Nevada research, which is why do you have any insights into why did teachers think they had to find their own materials? And I believe there was a follow-up question on this, which is, did the state provide financial education materials recommended? Which is so if you would talk more about that.
Yes. So a number of the teachers noted in the survey that they felt like there wasn't a lot of support provided by their schools, districts, or the state. And so I think a lot of them felt like they didn't know where to look for these resources, which is unfortunate because we know there are so many resources out there. And the folks at the state also said that they had distributed resources. And so I think there's some sort of miscommunication that's going on here. The state recommended resources like NGPF and EverFi, which are free for schools to use. And there are definitely places where they're being used, but there seems to be a disconnect that kind of however the state is communicating, a lot of teachers are not learning about it. And so kind of trying to bridge that disconnect seems really important.
Thank you. And then a related question, wanted to know if Utah actually posted financial education curriculum and materials for teachers.
So when the mandate was first implemented, we created a really robust finance in the classroom website that is widely utilized by both Utah teachers as well as teachers outside of the state. That resource unfortunately got very outdated and didn't link to some of the great resources that have since been developed. So we're looking at meeting that need by updating the Finance in the Classroom website with curricula that points to all of those great resources that are already out there and serves as a guide for teachers to implement those resources into their lesson plan. So doing some of the work, we found that the teachers are very overwhelmed by the number of resources out there, and it takes a lot of time to identify which the best ones are. So we're using the expertise from some of our veteran teachers and what are the best resources and how do you apply them so that our new teachers aren't as overwhelmed. So really looking forward to that. Hopefully we'll have that updated within the next few months. I will say that another important resource for our teachers has been our Utah Jumpstart Coalition does an annual summit where they bring in representatives from the different resources that are available and helps teachers incorporate those into their classrooms. That's been an important guide and resource for teachers in effectively teaching the subject, as well as the endorsement. So the endorsement that we've since implemented gives them that basic overview and background that they need to know that the resources exist and where to find them.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm gonna this one seems very timely, so I will end on this one, which is the State Board of Education is in the process of considering standalone personal finance standards in Pennsylvania. At a committee meeting yesterday, there was discussion of best practices in terms of implementation resources from other states and what works. Hindsight 2020, what might you suggest could have been done better, and or what would you recommend to states that are just now looking at implementing new standards and or requirements?
I can start with that one. And I feel like I've made the same point several times, but I feel like this communication between the state leadership and the schools and teachers was really important, and that the state leadership kind of felt like it was clear what they intended for schools to do, but what was happening on the ground or in the classrooms was not necessarily reflective of those intentions. And so kind of thinking through ways to kind of get the materials that teachers need into the classroom, to communicating more with teachers, is really important. I know this can be challenging in environments where local control is really important, but I think there are ways to kind of make resources accessible without requiring that teachers use them. And one example is that kind of the state had outlined teacher training as an important part of the reform, but we found that less than half of teachers had any professional development related to financial education. And so kind of that might be one way to kind of figure out, to kind of connect with teachers. I would also say that most of the teachers we talked to had some experience teaching financial literacy. There are definitely teachers out there in the state who are not teaching it at all, even though it is a requirement. And so kind of thinking about kind of how do you make sure that it's having the intended impact, kind of going through the different channels, and that will depend on the unique kind of state or district environments for how some of this information gets filtered down.
And some of the changes legislatively that we've made as the course has progressed and as the mandate has gotten older, one was requiring that teacher endorsement to help ensure that our teachers have the appropriate knowledge to effectively teach the course to students. So implementing that was a really important factor, since most teachers don't go to school to teach financial literacy. They go to school for one of the other core subjects. So that endorsement helped fill a gap that we found within the preparedness for teachers. Having strands and standards has also been helpful in at least pointing teachers in the right directions of concepts that they should be covering. And then within the legislation, there's a requirement that those strands and standards be reviewed and revised every few years to keep them up to date with rapidly changing information within the financial sector. And our State Board of Education has done a really great job at involving industry in that revision, which again has helped keep it up to date with the changes in the finance and economics industry. So I think that those are a few things that we've kind of learned along the way that have helped.
Excellent. Thank you all. I think that's a wonderful question to end on. And I know we have a few questions still in the Q&A that we were not able to get to, and we have been committing ourselves to following up with any Q&A questions with an answer following the webinar if we weren't able to address them. So thank you to all attendees who provided questions and for engaging with this webinar. So I will go ahead and close out with this wraps our a three-part series on the policy spotlight on K-12 financial education requirements. If you registered for one of these, you will have access to any of the three recordings from each of the three parts of the series. So if you were only able to attend one and you might be interested in another, you will have access to all three. And we will have additional webinars that will be announced in January 2024, again, leading up to NEFI's 2024 Financial Education Innovation and Impact Summit. And I also just want to end on, if you want more information about NEFI's work, you can visit www.nefi.org, which again, we will be disseminating the findings of the Nevada report once those are completed. So that's a great place to access those reports. So with that said, thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Griffin and Dr. Mulhern. This was an incredibly insightful webinar, and thank you to all of our attendees who joined us today to learn more about this important topic. I think that's it. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.